A black woman boards a first-class flight. Confident and composed, ready to return home after closing one of the biggest deals of her career. But just as she settles into her seat, a flight attendant approaches with suspicion, questioning her presence in first class. What begins as a subtle exchange quickly spirals into public humiliation when she is asked to move despite holding a fully paid ticket. The passengers around her watch in silence. But the woman doesn't argue. She calmly gathers her belongings and relocates to economy. What no one realizes is that she isn't alone. Her silent partner watching quietly from a few rows away sets in motion a series of actions that would not only challenge the airline but shake the entire industry. What happened next left the flight crew stunned, the airline scrambling, and passengers rethinking the power of silence. Stay with me, this is a story you'll want to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let me know where you're watching from. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button for more. Vanessa Blake stepped into Terminal B of JFK International Airport with the kind of presence that turned heads without demanding to. She was accustomed to spaces like these, liminal, crowded, buzzing with hurried conversations and the rhythmic drone of flight announcements overhead. The airport, with all its sleek surfaces and curated luxury, was meant to feel like the threshold to possibility. For Vanessa, it was simply another stop on the long and winding road of success, one paved with more compromises than celebrations. Her heels clicked softly against the marble tiles as she made her way to the security line, blending effortlessly with the business travelers, most of whom never bothered to meet her gaze. That suited Vanessa just fine. At 46, she had learned that the kind of attention she drew in spaces like this was rarely benign. Her tailored beige blazer was crisp against her dark skin, and the silk scarf knotted at her neck fell perfectly against her chest, an armor of sorts. Success, after all, had its uniform, but if the world had taught her anything, it was that no amount of success could insulate her from scrutiny. It happened in the smallest ways. The way the security officer's eyes lingered a fraction longer when she handed over her passport. How the woman behind her in line inched forward just enough to make clear she questioned if Vanessa was in the right lane, the TSA pre-check lane reserved for frequent flyers and first-class travelers. Vanessa had been here before, in one form or another. She smiled politely and stepped forward. The airport was a machine of efficiency. But like all machines, it had cracks, places where the humanity beneath the process bled through. By the time Vanessa reached gate 32, the early signs of fatigue pressed against her temples. She found her seat by the window, watching planes taxi across the tarmac. A gentle ding from her phone pulled her back to the present. Jason, assistant, boarding pass confirmed. First class, seat 2A, safe travels. Vanessa tucked her phone into her bag, allowing herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Seat 2A wasn't just a seat, it was the culmination of years of relentless work. Late nights spent preparing presentations for rooms full of men who spoke over her. Contracts negotiated in offices where her credentials had to be reproven each time she walked through the door. Seat 2A was earned. And in a world eager to deny her space, that mattered. She boarded early, stepping onto Horizon Airlines Flight 5671 with quiet ease. The first-class cabin greeted her with the familiar scent of leather seats and freshly brewed coffee. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "Good evening, ma'am," a younger flight attendant greeted her as she settled into her seat. "Can I get you anything before we depart?" "A water would be great. Thank you," Vanessa replied, her voice even, polite. For a moment, it felt like the flight would be uneventful. But peace, she knew, was often an illusion. It began with the faint shift in energy, a presence she felt before she saw. Michelle Harris entered the cabin with the kind of authority that came from years of knowing she was the enforcer of the unspoken rules. She wore her uniform like a badge and walked the aisle with the subtle sharpness of someone accustomed to keeping things in order. Michelle's eyes moved from passenger to passenger until they stopped inevitably on Vanessa. It wasn't the first time Vanessa had been looked at this way. A brief flicker of something Vanessa couldn't quite place crossed Michelle's face, something between curiosity and disapproval. It was brief, but not brief enough. Michelle's approach was calm, measured. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but impersonal. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Vanessa blinked, momentarily surprised. She glanced around the cabin. The older white gentleman in the seat beside her wasn't asked for his boarding pass. Neither was the couple across the aisle. But Vanessa knew better than to make assumptions aloud. She reached into her bag, retrieved the pass, and handed it over without protest. Michelle studied it longer than necessary, her eyes scanning every inch as though expecting to find something out of place. When she found nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, returning the pass without so much as a thank you. Vanessa didn't say a word. She didn't need to. There was a heaviness in the air now, the kind that lingers after a sharp word is spoken but left unacknowledged. Vanessa resumed reviewing emails on her phone, but the disruption had already done its damage. The sense of ease she carried on board was gone, replaced by the familiar weight of having to explain her existence, even when she didn't speak. The flight hadn't even left the ground. What unsettled Vanessa wasn't the act itself, it was the ordinariness of it. Racism, she had learned, rarely arrived in grand gestures or explicit confrontations. It was more often like this small, polite, almost imperceptible violations that chipped away at one's sense of belonging. It was the quiet violence of the ordinary. But Vanessa wasn't ordinary. She was exceptional, and people like Michelle always noticed. The flight was scheduled to last 5 hours and 42 minutes. But Vanessa Blake knew that time was often stretched by things you couldn't mark on a clock. The sharp glance from across the aisle. The brief pause before her card was accepted at a high-end store. The way someone's eyes would dart to the seat beside her as if to question whether it was rightfully hers. It had been 20 minutes since Michelle Harris, the head flight attendant, returned her boarding pass with that strained politeness Vanessa recognized too well. There was no apology, of course. Apologies, Vanessa had learned, were reserved for mistakes. What happened here wasn't considered one. Vanessa's phone buzzed faintly against her thigh. Jason, assistant, investor deck finalized. Everything's in place for tomorrow. Let me know if you need anything. Vanessa typed back quickly. Thank you, Jason. I'll see you at the office. The brief exchange was grounding. It reminded her that whatever this was only a detour. Tomorrow, she'd be back in her corner office, negotiating numbers and outcomes with the same calm precision she had used for years. But that was tomorrow. The present was less accommodating. A shadow fell across her tray table. Vanessa glanced up to see Michelle standing there again, this time flanked by a younger flight attendant, Clara. If Vanessa recalled her name tag correctly, Clara held a tablet close to her chest, her eyes darting nervously between Michelle and Vanessa, as if she had been briefed but wasn't sure she believed the story. Miss Blake, Michelle said, voice clipped but still wrapped in that thin veneer of professionalism. I'm afraid there's been a mix-up with your seat assignment. I'll need you to move to the main cabin. There it was. Vanessa set her phone down slowly, carefully, folding her hands in her lap. She had long understood the value of measured silence. I see, Vanessa replied, keeping her voice even. May I ask what the mix-up is? Michelle stiffened almost imperceptibly, as if she hadn't expected Vanessa to press. It appears your seat was double-booked. These things happen sometimes. I apologize for the inconvenience. But we'll need to resolve this now. Vanessa's eyes flickered to the empty seat across the aisle, then to the half-filled rows behind her. And the resolution, Vanessa said, her tone as smooth as glass, is for me to leave first class? Michelle's smile tightened. Yes, ma'am. There was no outburst, no raised voice, nothing so dramatic. But the tension in the cabin thickened all the same. Passengers turned slightly in their seats, pretending not to listen while hanging on to every word. Vanessa glanced at Clara, who shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the role she had been placed in. Her hand gripped the tablet a little tighter, as if she hoped it might shield her from the weight of the moment. Vanessa exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding long before this flight. I'd like to speak to your supervisor, she said, calm but unwavering. Michelle's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, something cold flickered behind them. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. Ma'am, I can assure you I have full authority. Authority. That was always the word, wasn't it? Authority didn't need to justify itself. It simply declared and expected compliance. Authority lived in the small gestures. Who was asked to step aside at security? Who was assumed to be out of place at the luxury counter? Who was forced to prove their worth in rooms where others walked in freely? Vanessa had spent her life navigating the soft edges of power, the way it disguised itself in protocol and policy. But she also knew something Michelle didn't. Vanessa was power. Her name, though Michelle didn't recognize it yet, carried weight in boardrooms far larger than the narrow aisle they were standing in. "I understand," Vanessa said finally, rising from her seat with a grace that felt deliberate. She retrieved her leather bag from the overhead compartment, the zipper humming softly beneath her fingers. As she stepped past Michelle, Vanessa caught the faintest flicker of satisfaction in the woman's eyes, a victory she thought she had secured. But Vanessa wasn't leaving without consequence. As she walked down the aisle toward the main cabin, she felt the ripple of whispers trailing behind her. Some passengers met her gaze with faint traces of sympathy. Others avoided eye contact altogether. She could feel Michelle's presence lingering behind her like a shadow, her authority validated by Vanessa's quiet compliance. But what Michelle didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was that Vanessa's silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. Vanessa settled into a narrow middle seat in the economy cabin, folding her blazer over the armrest with practiced ease. She unlocked her phone and began typing, fingers gliding effortlessly over the screen. "Incident on Flight 5671. Proceed as discussed." She hit send. Clara passed by moments later, her eyes catching Vanessa's as she offered a bottle of water with an apologetic glance. Vanessa accepted it with a nod, though the gesture wasn't necessary. She had long since grown accustomed to the quiet alliances of those who couldn't speak up, but still wished to be seen as decent. She appreciated it, but pity was not the currency Vanessa traded in. Far above the clouds, the flight settled into routine, the hum of the engines steady and rhythmic. But Vanessa knew this wasn't the end of the matter. There would be fallout, not in the loud, explosive way people imagined, but in emails sent from offices Vanessa's assistant would call directly. In calls made to the right executives, bypassing every middle manager who might try to soften the blow. Michelle would learn, as many had before her, that authority, real authority, did not wear a uniform. It did not carry a clipboard or cite obscure airline policy. Authority, Vanessa knew, walked quietly and left no doubt of its presence. And before this flight landed, Michelle would know that too. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, but Vanessa Blake could feel the descent long before it began. It was the kind of fall you learned to sense early, the slow erosion of dignity, the polite unraveling of one's place in spaces that weren't built to hold you. Vanessa sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of the narrow economy seat. The man to her left had already begun to doze, his elbow occasionally nudging her side as he shifted. To her right, a young woman swiped aimlessly through movies on the seatback screen, avoiding Vanessa's gaze with the well-practiced indifference of someone who had seen enough injustice to know it was safer not to acknowledge it. Vanessa, however, wasn't looking for acknowledgement. Her eyes rested on the faint shimmer of the curtain separating the cabins. Beyond it, seat 2A sat empty. It wasn't the seat itself that mattered. Vanessa had no particular attachment to the plush leather or the extra legroom. It was what the seat represented. The years spent working harder, arriving earlier, and staying later. The times she swallowed her pride because the greater victory was surviving long enough to demand something more. Seat 2A wasn't about comfort, it was about belonging. And somewhere along the way, someone had decided that her belonging needed to be negotiated. That was the thing about racism, it wasn't always loud. It rarely made grand entrances. More often, it slipped quietly into a room, rearranged the furniture, and left you standing in the doorway wondering if you had imagined the shift. Vanessa had imagined nothing. Michelle Harris was certain of her victory. She had watched Vanessa retreat down the aisle with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed the matter was settled. Vanessa recognized that look. It was the same expression she had seen on the faces of executives who dismissed her proposals only to present the same ideas 6 months later as their own. But Vanessa wasn't a woman easily dismissed. Her phone buzzed softly against her lap. Jason, assistant. Received. Legal team briefed. Executive relations aware. Vanessa allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Some lessons took longer to teach, but they were no less effective. A voice broke through her thoughts, the unmistakable lilt of Clara, the younger flight attendant. Clara's voice carried that nervous edge, the kind that lingered when someone was complicit in something they didn't agree with. "Excuse me," Clara whispered, kneeling slightly beside Vanessa's seat, her eyes flickering nervously toward the front of the plane. "I just wanted to check, is everything all right?" Vanessa met her gaze, noting the slight tremble in Clara's hand as she adjusted her apron. "I appreciate your concern," Vanessa said, her tone soft but unwavering. "But I believe you already know the answer." Clara's eyes dropped, guilt pooling beneath them. Clara hesitated. "I didn't think it was right. But Michelle, she's the lead." Vanessa stopped her with a gentle lift of her hand. "I understand. It's not you I'm holding accountable." Clara exhaled a quiet breath of relief, as if being absolved of blame somehow lessened the weight she carried. But Vanessa knew better. Clara's complicity was small, but not insignificant. It was the same complicity Vanessa had witnessed in boardrooms, the kind that allowed silence to stretch long enough for injustice to take root. And that was the trouble with complicity. It always started small. As Clara stood to leave, Vanessa's eyes followed her. "Clara," Vanessa called gently, stopping her just before she disappeared behind the curtain. Clara turned, her expression tentative. "There's power in the truth," Vanessa said quietly. "Don't let someone else teach you to ignore it." Clara hesitated for a long moment before nodding and disappearing into the first-class cabin. Vanessa returned to her phone, but her focus drifted. The weight of the moment pressed heavier than usual. Perhaps it was because Vanessa knew how this would unfold. Michelle, emboldened by her position, would continue her duties, unaware that the flight she thought she controlled had already shifted beneath her feet. Vanessa wasn't in the business of public confrontation. Her power lived in silence, the kind that called board members directly and rewrote policies without needing to raise its voice. But even Vanessa couldn't deny the ache that lingered in her chest. It wasn't about Michelle. It was about the accumulation of moments like these, the steady drip of indignities that gathered until they became a reservoir too heavy to carry alone. She thought of her grandmother, who used to sit at the front of the church with her hands folded neatly in her lap, daring anyone to question her place. "They'll try to move you," her grandmother had once told her, smoothing out the hem of her dress. "But you stay where you are, baby. And if they make you leave, you make sure they know you'll be back." Vanessa had spent her life making sure they knew she'd be back. And she wasn't finished yet. As the plane hummed softly beneath her, Vanessa leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. Seat 2A might be empty now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft rustle of pages and the hum of the engines. Vanessa Blake sat still in seat 28B, but her mind moved swiftly, mapping out the next steps with the precision of someone who had lived too long in the spaces where written rules faded, and the unwritten ones took hold. She recognized this space, this no man's land where authority shifted and twisted like smoke. It was the place where power lived when no one was watching, when protocol bent to the will of those who understood just how fragile the concept of fairness truly was. Vanessa had known the moment Michelle Harris first approached her seat that she wasn't being asked to leave because of policy. It was something older than policy, something that predated even the airline itself. Michelle wasn't following rules. She was following instincts. The kind of instincts passed down in hallways and boardrooms, inherited from the soft-spoken warnings of those who had walked this path before her. The kind that whispered, "She doesn't belong here," without ever needing to say the words aloud. Vanessa had lived long enough to recognize it for what it was. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the cabin lights to flicker. The man beside Vanessa stirred slightly, grumbling under his breath as he repositioned his elbow once more across the armrest, claiming more space than was his. Vanessa shifted but said nothing. Some battles, she knew, were too small to fight. Others were far too large to lose. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. Jason, assistant. Corporates aware. Senior VP notified. Standby for response. Vanessa didn't need to stand by. She already knew how this would unfold. It would start with quiet inquiries. Someone from the airline's executive team would discreetly reach out, asking for clarification on the situation. Words like misunderstanding and policy review would be thrown around as if they were shields strong enough to guard against the weight of the truth. By the time they landed, the airline would already be preparing the outlines of an apology, carefully worded, delicately balanced, designed to address the incident without acknowledging its cause. Vanessa could write the apology herself. We apologize for the inconvenience and regret any discomfort you may have experienced. It was always discomfort. Never humiliation. Never injustice. Just discomfort, as if the only thing that had been disrupted was the alignment of her seat. A soft knock of heels down the aisle broke her train of thought. Michelle was moving through the first-class cabin again, her gaze sharp and watchful. But there was something else now. A stiffness in her shoulders. A forced quality to the way she poured coffee and adjusted blankets. She was unsettled. Vanessa recognized the look. It was the face of someone who had just learned they were being watched. Michelle hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. She had anticipated the usual quiet compliance. A downcast gaze. Perhaps a frustrated sigh muffled behind polite indifference. But Vanessa hadn't given her any of those things. Vanessa had given her silence, the kind that lingered too long. The kind that told you someone wasn't done with you yet. As Michelle passed the curtain dividing first class from the economy cabin, Vanessa could feel the woman's hesitation. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the aisle. Vanessa didn't flinch. Michelle did. It was subtle, a flicker of doubt that crossed her face and was gone just as quickly. But Vanessa caught it. She always did. A voice came over the intercom, breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and expect a smooth flight ahead. We'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles in approximately 2 hours. Please enjoy the remainder of your flight." Vanessa exhaled softly, returning to the quiet hum of the cabin. But the weight of that flicker, the way Michelle's gaze faltered, lingered in the space between them. It was a small fracture. But fractures had a way of growing. She knew that the real confrontation wasn't between her and Michelle. The real confrontation was between Michelle and herself. Vanessa had seen it before, the moment when someone realized that the power they thought was theirs was nothing more than borrowed authority. Loaned out by institutions that only tolerated their judgment until it became inconvenient. And it always became inconvenient. Vanessa leaned back in her seat, letting her eyes drift across the cabin. The curtain between first class and economy felt thinner now, as if the distance between the two worlds had started to dissolve. She thought of her father, who used to tell her, "Baby, they'll give you the key to the front door, but they'll expect you to use the back." Her father had never lived long enough to sit in first class. But Vanessa carried his lessons with her every time she stepped into spaces like these. She didn't knock at the front door anymore. She walked straight through. And if someone tried to stop her, well, they'd learn soon enough. As the plane cruised silently through the sky, Vanessa opened her email and began drafting a formal incident report. Each word was precise, each detail crisp, recorded with the same clarity she used in board meetings where millions of dollars were at stake. By the time the plane touched down, the report would be ready. And so would she. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane coasted smoothly through the clouds. But the tension Vanessa Blake felt did not recede with the fading glow. She was no stranger to this feeling. It had been with her in elevators that paused too long when she stepped inside. In conference rooms where her ideas were met with silence until repeated by someone else. And now, it settled into seat 28B with the familiarity of an old, unwelcome companion. 2 hours remained until landing. 2 hours of carefully measured indignity. Vanessa glanced at the curtain ahead. The invisible boundary that separated first class from the rest of the plane. The curtain itself wasn't heavy, just a thin sheet of reinforced fabric. Light enough to sway when a flight attendant passed through. But it was not the weight of the curtain that divided the plane. It was something else, something thicker, heavier. The weight of assumptions. And assumptions, she knew, were harder to part than any curtain. A faint shuffle of footsteps caught her attention. Michelle Harris reappeared, moving down the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone eager to appear occupied but without real purpose. She wasn't serving drinks or responding to requests. She was patrolling. Vanessa saw this for what it was. Michelle's steps were less about ensuring passengers' comfort and more about reassuring herself. Power is a fragile thing when you are unsure of it. Michelle's eyes skimmed the rows. And Vanessa felt the brief pause when they settled on her. There was no exchange, no words, only the momentary weight of Michelle's gaze. An unspoken reminder that even from the other side of the curtain, she still wielded authority. Or at least, she believed she did. Vanessa did not look away. She held Michelle's gaze until the flight attendant shifted, clearing her throat and continuing down the aisle with a stiffness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. The game had changed. Michelle could feel it, even if she didn't understand why. Vanessa unlocked her phone, glancing at the screen. Jason, assistant. Senior VP requested to speak directly with the airline's executive team. Meeting set for tomorrow morning. Vanessa's lips tightened into a thin, unreadable line. Tomorrow. It was a curious thing. The way the world worked. A single interaction at 35,000 feet could shift the course of someone's career. Sometimes without them even knowing it. Michelle might have believed this moment would pass, swallowed by the ocean of routine customer service issues airlines dealt with daily. But Vanessa understood the truth: some moments do not pass. They settle, they linger, and sometimes, they grow roots. 30 minutes later, Clara returned to the economy cabin. Her steps were light, almost hesitant, as if she hoped to pass unnoticed. But Vanessa saw her coming. Clara stopped at Vanessa's row, bending down to speak softly. "Ma'am, I just wanted to check if you needed anything." Vanessa folded her hands neatly over her lap. "I'm fine, thank you." Clara lingered. She glanced nervously up the aisle as if Michelle might appear at any moment. I wanted to apologize," Clara whispered, lowering her voice further. "I didn't think it was right. What happened earlier? I mean." Vanessa regarded Clara carefully. There was sincerity in her eyes. But there was also something else: fear. "It wasn't your decision," Vanessa replied evenly. "I know how these things work." Clara looked as though she might say more. But words failed her. Instead, she nodded and moved on, disappearing through the curtain once more. Vanessa watched her go, feeling the weight of the young woman's guilt drift like smoke in the air. She had no anger for Clara. But guilt, Vanessa knew, had its limits. Clara's apology was quiet, fleeting, meant to ease her own conscience, not to undo the moment that had already passed. And therein lay the greater conflict. Racism did not thrive in noise. It thrived in silence. It grew in the moments when someone like Clara, someone who saw injustice, chose to look away. Vanessa had seen it countless times before. A younger colleague who knew she was passed over for a promotion but said nothing. A hotel clerk who watched another guest cut in front of her without intervention. And now, a flight attendant who watched Vanessa leave first class without asking why. Clara's apology was not unwelcome, but it was not enough. Vanessa knew that apologies like courtesy could be hollow when not paired with action. Near the front of the plane, Michelle's voice echoed softly as she addressed another first-class passenger. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. It wasn't Michelle she was thinking of now. It was the system that made Michelle possible. The policies that allowed bias to slip between the cracks, unnoticed by those who never needed to see it. Michelle believed she was protecting something: order. Perhaps exclusivity. But Vanessa knew better. Michelle was protecting an illusion. An illusion that suggested first class belonged to some more than others. An illusion that could be undone with a single phone call. Vanessa returned to her phone, typing a final message to Jason. After the meeting, request documentation on company-wide diversity and bias training programs. Let's see how thorough they really are. Jason's reply was immediate. Already on it. Vanessa's fingers lingered over the screen before locking her phone once more. As the plane began its gradual descent, the curtain ahead rippled faintly. The division between first class and economy trembled in the artificial breeze. Vanessa watched it sway. Some barriers, she thought, were not meant to last. The plane began its slow descent, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign punctuated the stillness of the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats. The familiar ritual of preparing for landing: seatbacks raised, tables folded away, belongings tucked beneath the seat. But Vanessa Blake remained as she was, eyes fixed on the thin fabric curtain ahead, watching as it swayed with the rhythm of the plane's movement. It was strange how such a small thing could carry so much weight. A curtain wasn't supposed to divide people. Not really. It was just cloth, a practical barrier between those who paid more for their tickets and those who didn't. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it? Vanessa had spent a lifetime walking through rooms where invisible curtains hung from the ceilings. They didn't billow like this one did, but she could feel them there, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but always present, separating who could speak and who must remain silent, Who had a seat at the table and who was expected to stand? This flight wasn't about a seat. It never had been. It was about the architecture of exclusion, the kind that was built into the bones of the world. So familiar that most people stopped noticing it altogether. Most people. But Vanessa had been born noticing it. Michelle Harris hadn't walked through the economy cabin since Clara's brief apology. Vanessa could feel her absence. That quiet refusal to meet her gaze. The way a child avoids the eyes of the teacher after misbehaving. Vanessa imagined Michelle standing in the galley, carefully arranging trays, her hands moving faster than necessary as if the busyness could smooth over the growing crack of doubt creeping into her mind. Vanessa had met countless Michelles in her life. The ones who didn't consider themselves racist, of course not. The ones who might have even voted for change, donated to causes, nodded sympathetically during conversations about inequality. But sympathy wasn't the same as recognition. And Michelle's mistake was not in her hostility, no. It was subtler than that. It was the certainty that she would be right. She must have made a mistake. Her ticket must have been mixed up. I don't need to check. I know who's supposed to sit here. It was an old song. One Vanessa had heard playing quietly beneath polite conversations her entire life. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our final approach shortly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Vanessa fastened her seatbelt, letting the routine ground her. But something else lingered. Clara appeared again, moving down the aisle with slower steps this time. She stopped briefly at Vanessa's row, as if searching for an excuse to linger. Vanessa turned slightly, her gaze lifting to meet Clara's hesitant eyes. Is there something I can do for you? Vanessa asked softly. Clara hesitated, shifting the weight from one foot to the other. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. She glanced down the aisle, her voice tightening. I am sorry. It didn't feel right. Vanessa offered a small, measured smile. I appreciate that, Clara, but you shouldn't apologize for someone else's choices. Clara nodded quickly, her hands tightening around the tray she held. I know, but, she faltered, as if the next words were too fragile to hold. I didn't stop it. Vanessa regarded her for a long moment. There was something genuine in the young woman's face. The kind of sincerity that hadn't yet been worn down by the compromises adulthood often demanded. You weren't supposed to stop it. Vanessa replied gently. But the next time you see it happen, and there will be a next time, remember that. Clara's eyes flickered with recognition, a silent understanding passing between them. She gave a faint nod and stepped away, disappearing behind the curtain once more. As the wheels lowered beneath the plane, Vanessa felt the soft tremor of the landing gear engaging. The runway lights stretched beneath them, glittering like small, distant stars against the evening haze. She unlocked her phone. Jason, assistant. I've forwarded the initial report to their legal team. Corporate wants to follow up after the flight lands. They'll likely reach out to you directly. Vanessa's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed slowly, deliberately. Good. Ensure that the final report highlights the systemic issue, not just the individual. She hesitated for a brief moment before adding. Also, schedule a meeting with HR next week. I'd like to review our internal policies. Sometimes we overlook our own curtains. Jason's reply was immediate. Understood. I'll handle it. Vanessa let out a slow breath, the quiet weight of exhaustion settling over her. It was always like this. The world didn't change overnight. It changed in inches, in small corrections, in silent decisions made during flights that seemed otherwise ordinary. But it did change. And for Vanessa, that was enough to keep moving forward. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Michelle reappeared in the aisle, standing rigid as passengers began collecting their bags. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Vanessa but dropped almost immediately, as if looking too long might unravel whatever thin thread of authority she still clung to. Vanessa met her gaze without hesitation. There was no confrontation, no final word, only the quiet recognition that something had shifted, and Michelle knew it, even if she didn't yet understand how. Vanessa rose from her seat with practiced ease, retrieving her bag from beneath the seat. She moved with the same calm, deliberate confidence that had carried her onto the plane hours earlier. But as she stepped into the aisle, she felt the invisible curtain parting in her wake. It would close behind her, as it always did, but one day those curtains would fall altogether. And when they did, Vanessa knew she would be ready. The plane exhaled with a mechanical sigh as it settled at the gate. Vanessa Blake remained seated, letting the rows of impatient passengers shuffle past her, their bags thudding against armrests and the occasional whispered, "Excuse me," brushing past her shoulder. She wasn't in a hurry. The real flight, the one that mattered, was just beginning. Michelle Harris stood at the front of the cabin, her uniform crisp, her eyes carefully avoiding the economy section. Vanessa noticed the way Michelle held herself. The way her hands rested a little too stiffly against the galley counter as if bracing for a storm she hoped might pass overhead. But storms don't pass, they arrive. And Vanessa had brought this one with her, quietly tucked beneath the lining of her calm exterior. Vanessa rose, reaching for her leather bag. The weight of it was familiar, a companion through years of boardrooms, negotiations, and long nights spent unraveling the knots others left behind. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the shift. Eyes followed her in that subtle way people watch without wanting to be caught. Curiosity tempered by discomfort. Vanessa didn't need their pity. Her steps down the aisle were measured, not as an act of defiance but of certainty. She knew that to walk too quickly, to rush past this moment, would feel like surrender, and surrender had never been her way. Michelle straightened as Vanessa approached, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Blake. Have a good evening." The words were smooth, rehearsed, but the air between them bristled with unspoken things. Vanessa paused, letting the moment linger. She watched Michelle's expression flicker, politeness beginning to fray at the edges. "I imagine," Vanessa said slowly, "that by now you've heard from your corporate office." Michelle's smile tightened. She began, but the words caught. She swallowed them, replacing them with silence. Vanessa leaned in slightly, not enough to invade space but enough to make the exchange impossible to dismiss. "I've spent years sitting in rooms where people like you underestimated me," Vanessa said, her voice calm but carrying weight. "They didn't know my name until it was printed at the bottom of the contract they signed. And I made sure they remembered it long after the ink dried." Michelle's eyes flickered downward, the rigid confidence she wore now paper thin. "This isn't just about me," Vanessa continued. "It's about every person who walks onto this plane and sees someone like you standing between them and the seat they earned." Michelle's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond but there was no defense. Vanessa's gaze softened, though not in forgiveness. There was no room for forgiveness here, only acknowledgement. "You should know," Vanessa added, "that I didn't escalate this because I wanted an apology. I escalated it because I wanted change. And by the time you step off this plane tonight, the conversation about you will have already begun." The words landed between them with quiet finality. Vanessa let the silence hang, then stepped past Michelle and into the jet bridge, the cool airport air greeting her like a second wind. The terminal bustled with travelers, each immersed in their own world, unaware that a small but significant shift had just occurred on Flight 5671. Vanessa moved through the crowd with ease, navigating the familiar tide of suitcases and families rushing toward connections. Her phone buzzed in her hand. "Jason, assistant. Meeting confirmed for 9 a.m. Corporate's reviewing the report. Legal has flagged it for immediate action." Vanessa typed quickly. "Good. Let's ensure this doesn't slip through the cracks." Jason replied almost immediately. "It won't. By the way, Michelle Harris has been placed on temporary leave pending investigation." Vanessa slowed her pace, allowing the weight of that message to settle. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. Not exactly. There was no pleasure in dismantling someone else's career. But there was relief, a quiet, steady kind that perhaps the next time a black woman settled into first class, she wouldn't be asked to prove she belonged there. Her father used to say, "The best way to fight back is to outlast them." Vanessa had outlasted many. As she neared the airport exit, Vanessa caught sight of Clara, the young flight attendant, standing near a row of chairs by the gate. Their eyes met briefly, and Clara offered a small, tentative nod. Vanessa returned it with a quiet smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. Vanessa adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped outside into the Los Angeles night. The city stretched out before her, vast and sprawling, indifferent to the weight of the injustices she carried with her. But Vanessa didn't need the city to care. She carried her own weight, and she carried it well. The conference room at Skyward Airways corporate office was pristine glass walls, minimalist decor, and the quiet hum of air conditioning that seemed to smooth over discomfort before it had a chance to settle. Vanessa Blake had been in many rooms like this. Rooms that concealed their hostility behind modern furniture and expensive coffee. She sat at the long, polished table, hands resting lightly on her lap. As executives filed in one by one, their expressions ranged from guarded professionalism to the faint unease of men who realized they were about to be lectured on rules they believed they had written. Vanessa understood this room before she even stepped inside. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Rice, Senior Vice President of Operations, a middle-aged man with graying temples and the air of someone who rarely encountered obstacles he couldn't outmaneuver. His smile was tight, perfunctory. "Ms. Blake," Rice began, folding his hands as if in prayer, "I'd like to start by personally apologizing for your experience on Flight 5671. This is not the standard we hold ourselves to." Vanessa offered a polite nod. She had heard this cadence before, the slow, careful unspooling of damage control, delicately draped in language that avoided the truth. "I appreciate the apology," Vanessa said, her voice even, "but we both know this wasn't about standard." The room grew still. Rice shifted slightly in his chair, but his practiced smile didn't falter. "Of course," he replied, carefully. "We're reviewing the incident thoroughly. Ms. Harris has been placed on leave pending the outcome. We take these matters very seriously." Vanessa leaned forward, just slightly, allowing her gaze to settle directly on him. "With respect, Mr. Rice, the issue isn't just Ms. Harris," she said. "You can discipline one employee, but it won't change the fact that she didn't invent the problem. She was simply following an unwritten rule, a rule your airline has never had to acknowledge because it was never written down in the first place." A flicker of discomfort crossed Raya's face. For the first time, he broke eye contact. Vanessa continued, "This isn't about a misunderstanding," she said. "This is about how bias functions in spaces like these. It doesn't shout. It doesn't throw punches. It sits quietly in first class, waiting for someone like me to walk by, and assumes I'm lost." Rice cleared his throat, but Vanessa pressed on, her voice calm but unyielding. "You can't fix this by issuing memos. You can't fix it by placing one employee on administrative leave. You fix it by dismantling the architecture that allowed it to happen in the first place." The room, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa let the silence stretch, allowing her words to settle into the spaces between them. She had long learned the power of pause, how discomfort could be a teacher when left to linger. Finally, Rice nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. "You're right," he said, the polish in his tone now slightly dulled. "We need to do better." Vanessa allowed herself a small, measured smile. "I'll hold you to that," she replied, as she stepped out of the conference room. The weight Vanessa carried felt a little lighter, not because the fight was over, but because another door had opened. Clara was waiting by the elevators. She straightened when she saw Vanessa approach. "Ma'am," Clara said softly, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. I wanted to say thank you." Vanessa paused, tilting her head slightly. "For what?" "For not letting it go," Clara replied. "For saying something I don't know if I would have." Vanessa regarded the young woman carefully. Clara's sincerity was clear, but Vanessa recognized the uncertainty behind her words. "Clara," Vanessa said gently, "I didn't say something because I wanted to. I said something because I had to." Clara nodded, the truth settling over her like the first hint of rain before a storm. Vanessa stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind her with a soft whisper. As she descended, Vanessa thought of her grandmother, who had once told her, "You may not see the change in your lifetime, but you must still plant the seeds." Vanessa had spent a lifetime planting them, and someday, someone like Clara would see them bloom.